Somewhere in Siberia, on a night in 1982, the sky turned to fire. An explosion of staggering proportions tore through the silence of the taiga, so large that American satellites recorded it from space. So violent that for a few seconds, analysts at the CIA didn't know what they were looking at, whether it was a nuclear test, an industrial accident, or the beginning of something far worse. The smoke column rose and rose. The heat was visible from orbit. The White House Situation Room went on high alert. They stared at the satellite imagery for several minutes before anyone said anything. And then, slowly, the picture became clear. This was not an attack. This was not a nuclear test. Something had gone catastrophically wrong inside Soviet infrastructure. Something the Soviets themselves did not yet understand. And the men in that room, the analysts, the advisors, the people who had spent their careers inside the machinery of the Cold War, allowed themselves very quietly to smile, because they knew exactly what had happened. They had made it happen. That story, how a single human being walked into the heart of the KGB and handed the United States the most devastating intelligence gift of the entire Cold War, begins not in Washington, not in Moscow, but in Paris, in a cafe, with a conversation that should never have taken place. The man's name was Vladimir Vetrov. The Americans called the operation Farewell, and what he did changed the Cold War more than any weapon ever could. Before we go back to the beginning, one thing you need to understand. The CIA director at the time, William Casey, later said that what Vetrov delivered was unlike anything his agency had ever received from any source, in any country, in its entire history. The French president personally carried the dossier to a G7 summit and handed it to Reagan in private. Senior American officials described it as the most consequential intelligence transfer between allies in the entire Cold War. And what Reagan did with it, what the CIA engineered using that intelligence, contributed in ways analysts are still measuring today to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. All of that came from one man, one disillusioned engineer, one cold night in Moscow, and a decision that cost him everything. This is that story. To understand what Vetrov did, you first have to understand what the KGB actually was, not the KGB of the movies, with its agents in trench coats carrying silenced pistols. The real KGB, the bureaucratic, omnipresent, suffocating KGB, an organization with tentacles in every factory, every school, every neighborhood in the Soviet Union. An organization that surveilled its own members with the same ferocity it turned on external enemies. An organization where trust was a tool, never a feeling. Inside that structure was a division called Directorate T. The T stood for technology. And the mission of Directorate T was simple, brutal, and extraordinarily effective. The Soviet Union was losing the technological race with the West. Rather than try to win that race in the open, Directorate T had arrived at a ruthlessly pragmatic conclusion. Why invent when you can steal? Why spend decades developing microelectronics when American engineers have already done it for you? Why research rocket propulsion when European laboratories already have the answers written on classified paper that can be photographed, copied, and transported? The operational arm of Directorate T was called Line X. And Line X was the largest technological theft operation ever assembled in the history of human espionage. It had agents in Paris, in London, in Washington, in Tokyo. It had sources inside private laboratories, inside universities, inside defense contractors. It had contacts, intermediaries, and collection networks that operated with near-industrial efficiency. Every year, enormous volumes of Western technical documents arrived in Moscow. Computer designs, avionics prototypes, industrial control software, advances in materials, science, chemistry, and nuclear physics. The Soviet Union was, in many ways, building its technological arsenal with borrowed hands, and Vladimir Vetrov was one of the men who evaluated what those hands brought back. He was also, without anyone knowing it yet, the man who would eventually burn those hands to the bone. He had been born in Moscow in October 1932. The son of industrial workers, intelligent enough to gain admission to the Bauman Institute, Russia's most prestigious engineering school, the Soviet equivalent of MIT. He was an athlete, a gifted sprinter, once considered an Olympic prospect. He had the kind of physical and intellectual presence that people notice without quite being able to define why. In 1959, at the age of 27, he did something unusual. He sent an unsolicited letter of application to the KGB. He wasn't recruited, he applied, and he was accepted. He went through training, he learned the trade. He was assigned to Directorate T at a time when Line X was still expanding its global network. He had the ideal profile, an engineering background that gave him the technical credibility to evaluate stolen material, fluency in French that made him perfect for operations in the West, and a charisma, that particular quality that makes people lower their guard without knowing exactly why. In 1965, Vetrov was posted to Paris. He stayed 5 years, and Paris rebuilt him into something the Soviet Union had not anticipated. It wasn't a dramatic epiphany, it wasn't a single moment of revelation. It was something slower, more insidious, harder to name. It was the cafes, the restaurants, the bookstores with their uncensored shelves, the way people walked down the street without looking over their shoulders. The casual, almost unconscious abundance of a society where food was on the shelves and films were in the cinemas without anyone needing permission to exist. Vetrov did his job. He collected information. He cultivated contacts, among them a French engineer at the company Thomson CSF named Jacques Prévost, who would become, a decade later, the thread by which everything would unravel. Vetrov fulfilled his missions. But while doing all of it, he was absorbing the West with an intensity he may not yet have fully understood himself. When he returned to Moscow in 1970, he carried something back with him that didn't appear in any of the reports he handed to the KGB. He carried a comparison. And comparisons, inside a system like the Soviet one, are slow poison. It would take 10 more years for that poison to find its way out. The years passed. Vetrov continued his work inside Directorate T. He rose to positions of real responsibility. He had access to highly sensitive material, not only the documents arriving from the West through Line X, but the names and cover identities of all the agents collecting them, the networks transporting them, the entire architecture of the world's largest technological espionage operation. But the promotions he expected never came. The career he had imagined for himself never materialized the way it should have. There were less competent men, better connected men, rising around him while he stagnated. There was a growing sense that the system had not only lied to the world, it had lied specifically to him. It had made a promise it never had any intention of keeping. The KGB paradoxically had its own nepotism, its own clan loyalties, its own invisible glass ceilings. And Vetrov had hit his head against that ceiling so many times that the pain had transformed into something else, into anger. There is a moment, difficult to pinpoint with precision, when a man stops being loyal to an idea and starts doing the math. For Vetrov, that moment arrived sometime in the 1970s, but he did nothing. Not yet. The betrayal, when it finally came, was neither cold nor calculated. It was almost accidental. At the end of 1980, Vetrov crossed paths again with Jacques Prévost, the French engineer he had known in Paris 15 years earlier. The encounter could have been nothing more than a brief exchange between two men from another chapter of their lives. But Vetrov, in a gesture that mixed desperation, courage, and perhaps a considerable amount of alcohol, went further than the moment called for. He said he had things to offer. Prévost understood immediately what that meant. He was not a naive man. He had spent enough years around intelligence circles to recognize the weight of what Vetrov was implying. He also understood the personal risk he was taking by becoming the conduit. If the KGB ever traced the leak back through him, a French engineer with no diplomatic immunity would have very few options. He made the necessary contacts anyway, and within weeks, Vladimir Vetrov was in communication with officers from the DST, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, the French domestic counterintelligence service. Prévost never became famous. He never received a public medal or a ceremony. He is a footnote in most accounts of this story, but without him, there is no farewell. Without a French engineer willing to risk his life on a conversation in Moscow, one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the Cold War never begins. The French gave him a code name, Farewell, in English, not in French. That was not an accident. It was a deliberate intelligence decision, If the KGB ever discovered the codename, they would automatically assume Vetrov was working for the American CIA, not for the French DST, an extra layer of protection built into a single word. What followed was one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire history of espionage. Vetrov was not a cautious informant who sold information slowly, testing the water, protecting himself at every step. He was the opposite. He was a man who had stored years of frustration and disillusionment, and who now, finally, had a channel for all of it. He went from zero to everything in a matter of months, and he did all of it without a single piece of sophisticated technology. No shortwave radio, no burst transmissions, no miniaturized devices or cutting-edge cameras or any of the artifacts that spy films have made indispensable in the popular imagination. He used letters, physical letters, delivered through a system of dead drops, prearranged locations where messages could be deposited and collected without the parties needing to meet in person, a hollow in a wall, a hidden space behind an object, the modern equivalent of a tradition stretching back to the espionage operations of classical antiquity. It was primitive, it was slow, and it worked for months, because Vetrov was a professional who had spent decades learning not to draw attention, and because the sheer enormity of what he was doing made him paradoxically safer. No one inside the KGB had modeled the possibility of a betrayal of this scale. The detection mechanisms simply were not calibrated for something of this magnitude. It was like stealing the vault while the security guards were watching the ATM. Between the spring of 1981 and early 1982, Vetrov handed the DST nearly 4,000 classified documents. 4,000. That number needs a moment to land. These were not sketches, not fragments. They were complete, detailed, specific documents. They included the names and cover identities of 250 Line X officers stationed under diplomatic cover in embassies around the world. They included the complete operational manual of Directorate T, its targets, its methods, its acquisition programs, its sources, its transport networks. They included the exact list of Western technological programs the Soviet Union was attempting to infiltrate. They were, in practical terms, a complete X-ray of how the world's largest communist power had been spying on and stealing technology from the West for decades. The French were stunned, and with material like that in their hands, they did what any serious intelligence service would do. They went straight to the top. François Mitterrand, the President of France, personally received the dossier. He read it. He understood its magnitude. And on July 19, 1981, on the margins of the G7 summit at the Château Montebello in Quebec, he pulled Ronald Reagan aside. What Mitterrand revealed in that private meeting was described by Reagan's national security advisor, Richard Allen, as a remarkable gift. Perhaps the most valuable intelligence gift one ally had ever given the United States in the history of the Cold War. Reagan returned to Washington with something no American president had ever possessed. Not fragments, not assumptions, not indirect analysis. A complete, documented, verifiable picture of the Soviet technological espionage machine. The name of every agent, the method of every operation, the target of every program, an X-ray. And then the CIA stepped in. What the Americans did next was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty that analysts of intelligence still admire to this day. A CIA economist named Gus Weiss presented Director William Casey with a proposal that was, in its essence, a complete reversal of the Soviet playbook. Rather than simply using the intelligence to arrest spies, though they did that too on a massive scale, resulting in the expulsion of roughly 150 Soviet agents from countries around the world, Weiss proposed something far more subtle, far more devastating. Knowing exactly which technologies Line X was trying to steal, knowing exactly which channels it used to acquire them, the CIA began to manipulate what it allowed to slip through. Software with hidden defects, engineered to appear flawless until the critical moment they would fail catastrophically. Industrial blueprints with subtle engineering errors, invisible in theory, disastrous in practice. Designs that worked perfectly in a laboratory, but that, at industrial scale, would produce catastrophic results. Poisoned technologies that Line X agents stole with satisfaction and that Soviet engineers implemented with enthusiasm, not knowing they were building their own traps. And then we arrive at the explosion in Siberia. The Trans-Siberian Pipeline was a project of critical strategic importance to the Soviet Union, an artery transporting natural gas across thousands of miles, generating the hard currency the regime desperately needed. To operate it efficiently, the Soviets required a sophisticated computerized pressure management system. They attempted to purchase one legally from a Canadian company. The Americans blocked the sale. The Soviets then did what they always did. They sent Line X to steal it, and Line X stole it. What they didn't know, what no one on the Soviet side knew, was that the software had been tampered with before being left within the reach of the spies. The CIA, using Vetrov's intelligence to know exactly where the Soviets would look, had embedded a time bomb inside the code. An error that would remain invisible during normal operation, but that, under specific pressure conditions, would reverse the behavior of the pipeline's control valves. In 1982, those conditions were met. What followed was described by Thomas Reed, a former Secretary of the Air Force serving on the National Security Council at the time, as the largest non-nuclear explosion in history, visible from space, recorded by surveillance satellites. Of a magnitude that put the White House Situation Room on high alert for several minutes until the source was identified. No human beings died. The pipeline was rendered inoperable. The economic damage was enormous. And the Soviet Union never understood what had happened. Vetrov had turned the Soviet theft machine into a knife that cut its own hand. But while all of this was unfolding at the highest levels of two superpowers, while Reagan was briefing his cabinet and CIA analysts were watching the satellite footage of the Siberian sky, the man who had made all of it possible was coming apart in a Moscow parking lot, and no one had seen it coming, including Vetrov himself. There is something tragic and ironic about the fall of Vladimir Vetrov that no Hollywood screenwriter would have dared to invent. The man who had successfully deceived the most powerful intelligence organization in the world for nearly 2 years was not brought down by a brilliant counterintelligence operation. He was not betrayed by a suspicious colleague. He was not exposed by a technical failure in a radio transmission. He was brought down by himself. February 1982, a cold night in Moscow. Vetrov is in a car with a woman, not his wife, a mistress. A relationship that, like so many things in his life at that point, had curdled into something loaded with resentment, recrimination, and vodka. Nobody knows exactly what was said inside that car. Nobody knows precisely how the argument began. What we know is the kind of pressure that had been building inside Vetrov for months. The weight of nearly 2 years of double life, of handing over 4,000 classified documents while continuing to walk into KGB headquarters every morning, of drinking more and sleeping less, of becoming a man who existed in 2 parallel realities and could no longer fully inhabit either one. Espionage is not only a profession. At a certain point, it becomes a psychological condition. And the mind, under that kind of sustained pressure, does not always break in the ways you might expect. Sometimes it doesn't break at all. It simply reaches a point where the most ordinary friction, the most mundane argument, becomes the final straw on a weight that has been accumulating for years. What is known is what came next. Vetrov stabbed the woman. She survived. But then a man knocked on the car window, someone who had noticed the commotion from outside and came to check. Vetrov, in a state of paranoia and panic that only alcohol and years of living a double life can produce, had one immediate thought. They had found him. It was the KGB. It was over. He stabbed the man too. The man died. When the dead man's identity was confirmed, the situation became even more complicated. He was another KGB officer, a colleague, someone from the same world Vetrov had spent his career inside. The irony was almost too dark to absorb. The man who had been systematically dismantling the KGB for 2 years had just killed one of its members in a parking lot, in a panic, because of a domestic argument. Vetrov was arrested that same night. It was the end, but not in the way he had imagined, because the KGB at that moment still did not know who it was dealing with. To the initial interrogators, Vetrov was a Soviet officer who had committed a homicide in a drunken state. A serious case, yes, one that would destroy a career and ruin a family. But there was no apparent reason yet to suspect anything of a different order. In the fall of 1982, Vetrov was tried and sentenced to 12 years for murder. He was sent to serve his time in a labor camp in Siberia. For nearly 2 years, the story seemed to end there. But then something happened that is perhaps the most extraordinary element of this already extraordinary story, and the one that says the most about the kind of man Vetrov was. While serving his sentence in Siberia, Vetrov started talking. Not a strategic confession, not a negotiation for benefits. It was vanity. It was the unbearable weight of having done the most extraordinary thing anyone in that labor camp had ever done, and having to pretend to be just another convict. It was perhaps the same impulsiveness that had put him in that car on that February night. Vetrov began letting slip, casually, that he had done something big, something people couldn't imagine. The information reached the KGB, and the KGB pulled the thread. What surfaced as they pulled was of a magnitude that the interrogators themselves took time to believe. Every document verified led to another. Every name revealed another name. The full extent of the betrayal expanded with each hour of questioning, like a stain that wouldn't stop spreading. Vetrov was brought back to Moscow, to Lefortovo prison. The KGB promised he would not be executed if he provided a full confession. Vetrov complied. He wrote a document called The Confession of a Traitor, a blistering denunciation of the Soviet system he had served for decades. This totalitarian order crushes individuals and promotes discord between people, he wrote. And then, in the final lines of his confession, the lines that circulated within the KGB and that historians still cite today, he wrote something the organization had never read from any traitor it had ever caught. He wrote, "My only regret is that I was not able to cause more damage to the Soviet Union and render more service to France." The KGB did not keep its promise. Vladimir Vetrov was tried for treason in November 1984, convicted by the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union, and executed with a single shot to the back of the head on January 23, 1985, inside Lefortovo prison in Moscow. He was 52 years old. His remains were never returned to his family. His wife learned of his execution through official channels, a brief, cold notification, the kind the Soviet state had perfected over decades of delivering unbearable news in administrative language. She had known for years that something was deeply wrong. She had not known what. Now she knew everything all at once, in a letter she could not share with anyone. The KGB made sure of that. To speak about Vetrov, to grieve him publicly, to acknowledge what he had done, was to become complicit in the very thing that had gotten him killed. She carried the weight of it alone. What she felt, history does not say. The files do not preserve that kind of truth. And Vetrov himself, the man at the center of all of it, died without understanding the full shape of what he had set in motion. He died without knowing that the Siberian explosion had been a direct consequence of his intelligence. He died without knowing that the roughly 150 Line X agents expelled from Western countries in the preceding years had been identified using the map he had drawn. He died without knowing that Richard Allen, Reagan's national security advisor, would describe Operation Farewell as one of the turning points of the Cold War. He died without knowing that serious analysts, people with access to documents the general public would never see, would say, decades later, that the combination of exposing the Soviet espionage networks and poisoning the flow of stolen technology had created a structural fracture that added to all the other fractures, and that had contributed, in a way that resists precise measurement, to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. There was no ceremony for him, no recognition, no gravestone bearing his real name, only the cold of January and silence. What remains when we look at Vladimir Vetrov's life from the distance of decades is something that resists simplification. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He was a man full of contradictions, loyal and treasonous, disciplined and self-destructive, capable of extraordinary patience in one context and catastrophic impulsiveness in another. A man who had served a system for decades and who, when he decided to turn his back on it, did so not with an elaborate plan, but with something closer to an eruption than a strategy. There is a temptation to ask why he did what he did, what the real motivation was. Whether it was ideology, it did not seem so. He had not embraced capitalism as a system, had not converted to any Western cause. Whether it was money, the French did pay him, though nothing that justified the existential risk of what he was doing. Whether it was professional frustration, which is what biographer Sergei Kostin, who had access to the files and to people who knew Vetrov personally, believes, the revenge of the underappreciated man whose merits couldn't break through the KGB's ceiling of nepotism, or whether it was something harder to name, that feeling that sometimes overcomes people who have spent their lives serving something larger than themselves and who wake up one day with a question they can no longer put back. Larger than me, yes, but true. The most honest answer is that it was probably all of those things at once. Human motivations are rarely clean, rarely a single color. Vetrov had reasons that mixed and contradicted each other inside him, and he himself could not have separated them with precision if anyone had asked. What matters is what he did with them. But the story of Farewell has an additional layer that most espionage narratives ignore. And that is perhaps the most important of all for understanding what actually happened in the long run. For decades, the Soviet Union had built its technological modernization on a foundation of systematic theft. Directorate T was not an appendage of the KGB. It was in many ways one of the pillars of the Soviet project to maintain parity with the West. Estimates suggest that in the 1970s and early 1980s, more than a third of all Soviet military research and development depended on intelligence obtained through espionage. A third. The American defense advisor who reviewed the Farewell dossier put it plainly: American science was sustaining their national defense. This meant the Soviet Union had built a structural dependency on technological theft. It had outsourced part of its own progress to the laboratories of the countries it declared as enemies. And when that source was poisoned, when the documents arriving from Paris, from London, from Washington began to contain traps instead of advances, the effect was not merely a handful of failed projects. It was a systemic rupture. Think of it as an infection. Line X had spent years inserting Western technology into the body of Soviet industry. Computers controlling factories, software managing critical infrastructure, engineering designs underpinning large-scale production decisions. When part of that material began to be deliberately sabotaged before being left within reach of the spies, the virus entered alongside the information, and once inside, it was impossible to trace. The Soviets didn't know what was functioning correctly and what had been tampered with. They couldn't simply stop using stolen technology. They were already profoundly dependent on it. They couldn't audit every system with the depth necessary to identify the hidden flaws. They lacked the technical resources to do so, which was precisely the problem that had led them to steal in the first place. The diabolical elegance of the American response lay exactly there. The CIA did not destroy the Soviet capacity to steal technology. It transformed that capacity into a permanent vulnerability. Every successful theft became an unanswerable wager. Was this real intelligence, or was it a trap? And with no way to know, Line X continued operating, but with a confidence corroded from within, like wood that looks solid on the surface, but has already turned to dust on the inside. Gus Weiss, the CIA economist who had designed the operation, later said that the heart of the Soviet technology collection program had collapsed and would not recover. He was right. There is a parallel with something far older than the Cold War, with the Trojan horse, with the false messengers in Sun Tzu's Art of War, with the mirrors Archimedes supposedly turned against the Romans. The idea that the greatest blow you can strike against an adversary is not to destroy their strength, but to make their strength turn against them. Not to win on the battlefield, to contaminate the entire battlefield so thoroughly that the adversary no longer knows where it is safe to step. Vladimir Vetrov was, without knowing it, the catalyst for one of the greatest examples of that principle in modern history. But there is also in this story a figure who almost never appears in the main narratives and who deserves a moment of attention. Vetrov's wife. She knew something had changed, not about the documents, not about the scale of what he was doing, but she knew about the absences that didn't add up, the tensions that found no words, the alcohol that was increasing, the distance that kept growing, a husband who wore his own face, but who had gone somewhere she couldn't reach. Espionage destroys the people who practice it. That is almost a law. But it also destroys more quietly the people around them, those who live close to the secret without ever knowing its name. In the years that followed Vetrov's death, Operation Farewell was gradually declassified. Memoirs were written, documents were released. Officers from the DST and the CIA who had worked with the material began to speak, with the caution of people who had spent decades practicing silence, but with the urgency of those who feel that history deserves to be told before the witnesses disappear. The picture that emerged from those accounts was richer, more ambiguous, more human than any textbook espionage narrative. Vetrov was not the idealized spy of novels and films. He was a man full of contradictions who, at a given moment in his life, made a choice that echoed far beyond the walls of any room he ever sat in. And then there is that final line of his confession. That sentence the KGB had never read from any traitor it had ever captured, and that historians still quote decades later. "My only regret is that I was not able to cause more damage to the Soviet Union and render more service to France." That is not the response of a broken man. It is not the response of someone consumed by regret. It is the response of a man who, even facing death, had done the math and arrived at a conclusion that had not changed. What he had done was worth what it cost. This is, in the end, the story of Vladimir Vetrov. Not a story of clean heroism, not a story of clear villainy. The story of a complicated human being, undone in part by his own contradictions, who at a given moment in his life chose to do the math. The Cold War was full of stories like this. Men and women who operated in the shadows, who never appeared in headlines while they lived, who carried secrets that changed the world without the world knowing their names. Most of those stories remain classified. Some were told incompletely, distorted by time or political convenience. Some were carried to the grave by people who had practiced silence for so long it became part of them. The story of Farewell is one of the rare ones that survived intact enough to be told. And what it says, what it keeps saying decades later to anyone willing to listen, is that history is rarely made by great armies or great declarations or great movements that appear in textbooks. It is made more often by a single person, on a cold night, with something they can no longer swallow. Vladimir Vetrov was executed on January 23, 1985. 6 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. There is no straight line to draw between those two facts. History doesn't work that way. It is always multiple, always accumulated, always made of layers that overlap in ways that resist any simple narrative. The Soviet collapse had economic, political, social, and ideological causes that stretched back far before any espionage operation. But there are serious analysts, people who have spent decades studying this period with access to documents the general public will never see, who say that Farewell was one of the accelerators. That the combination of exposing the Soviet networks and poisoning the flow of stolen technology created a structural crack that added to all the other cracks. That it reinforced Reagan's conviction that the Soviet economy, stripped of its stolen technological advances, could be pushed toward collapse, and that this conviction guided a strategy that worked. That the nail which helped dismantle the machine was driven, in part, by a disillusioned engineer on a night in Moscow, in a moment of impulsiveness that lasted less than a second, and changed the world. That is the nature of the moments that change history. You rarely recognize them while they are happening, and the people who create them rarely survive to see the result.